The next section that we're going to talk about is materials. Now, when light hits a surface, some portion of that light is scattered as it reflects. If the surface has a lot of surface imperfections in it, or a lot of nooks and crannies, the light that's reflected back is reflected at various angles, inconsistent angles. This is what's known as diffuse. So it's almost like a scattered light across the surface. Now, if the light that's reflected back is at a more consistent angle, for, let's say, a very shiny surface or a surface with very few imperfections, this is what's known as the specular component of the light. So let's go and look at some of the material types that we have in Maya. So this is a Lambert, and if we just double click on it, you'll notice that here's the diffuse component, but there's no specular component for a Lambert shader. So this type of a shader is actually really good for matte surfaces. I'm just going to create a Phong here. And let's just look at the attributes for the Phong. It also has a diffuse, but it has a separate section for controlling the specular highlights. Okay, so you can change the color of the highlight as well as how hard the highlight is or how soft the highlight is. This type of a material is good for shiny plastic or glass. And then the third most common type of material is the Blinn. And I'm just going to move this over here. Again, here's the diffuse, and specular shading attribute is down here. So you have nice control over the specular shading. It also has an extra attribute called the specular roll-off. And what that does is it allows the surface to reflect more of its surroundings based at a viewing angle. So there are some surfaces that will appear shinier at glancing angles. One that I can think of is maybe a car when it's just got out of the car wash. If you look at it at an angle, it's much more reflective than if you were looking at it straight on. So I'm just going to map the reflected color with a checker and just show you that. Oops. So let's just regraph this. And there we go. So if we start moving this down, the specular roll-off down, you'll notice on our shader icon that the reflectivity is much stronger along the edges of our sphere here. Okay? Now in terms of expense, with these three different types of shaders, let's just go up here. Lambert is the least expensive, so it's quicker to render. Then Phong and Blinn is one of the most expensive ones. Let's look at some of the specialized materials that we have here. I'm just going to go back to the work area and clear it. So the anisotropic shader. Now this type of a material is good for mimicking surfaces that have microfaceted grooves. So records or CDs or satin Christmas balls, that type of a thing. And you'll notice that the specular shading attributes, there's many of them here, and that actually controls the specular shading. The angle is the direction that the grooves are going to go in. The spread X and Y is really just the distance between these grooves. When the roughness attribute is high, the surface is going to be much rougher looking, so more like a record as opposed to a CD, which is much shinier, so we would probably move this value down. And then the Fresnel, now the higher this value is, the brighter the highlights you're going to get. So let's look at some of the other materials that we have. Let's look at the layered shader. Now if we go to the layered shader's attribute, you'll notice that it doesn't look like any of the other shaders. I'm just going to delete the anisotropic shader here. But it does have this section here called layered shader attributes. Now what the layered shader does is it allows you to layer different types of shaders on top of one another. So you could have one surface that exhibits the shininess of a Phong, but in some areas exhibits the matteness of a Lambert. And I'll just quickly set that up for you. So let's grab a Phong. And let's go ahead and grab a Lambert. Okay? And the way that you're going to put these into the attribute editor here is just by middle mouse button dragging them. Okay, so middle mouse button drag and drop, drag and drop. This is just a placeholder here. We don't need that. Now if we look at kind of what we're ending up with here, it looks like just the regular Lambert shader. So I'm just going to graph that a little nicer. And I'm just going to change the colors of these so we can actually see which is which. So we'll make that red And we'll make this blue. Okay, so you can see that the layered shader just looks like a red Lambert shader. So what we need to do is make sure that we have some sort of transparency between these two layers so that we can see the layer underneath. Incidentally, the Phong 2 is at the bottom and the Lambert 3 is on top. Okay, so anything that's on the far right is the bottommost layer, and whatever's on the left is topmost layer. So let's go ahead and in the transparency channel, actually let's just change that there. Sorry, for Lambert 3 in the transparency channel, let's just map a check texture map. Okay, so now, I mean, if we were to move this light, we would actually see the specular highlight that's on the blue. It would actually stop once it hit the matte surface of the Lambert. I just want to point out too that there is a compositing flag here. By default it's on layered shaders, but you can change it to layered texture, and what that's going to allow you to do is pile textures on top of one another. And it works the same way as the shaders. Middle mouse button, drag and drop. Make sure that there's transparent information between the layered textures. And then if you want, what you're going to end up with is something that's kind of flat. It doesn't have any shading, any kind of shading attributes to it. So what you're going to do is you're going to take the whole network that you get, and you're going to plug it into either a blend shader or a Phong shader or what have you, just to give your texture maps some sort of material that you can work with. So let's just close that down and clear this. And let's talk about the shading map. Okay, and if we double click on it, you'll notice too that it's missing some of the attributes that some of the regular shaders have, but it's got a shader attribute and a shading map color. So let's just go ahead and create a Phong, and middle mouse button, drag it, drop into the shader, and just with the shading map color, I'm going to add a ramp. Okay, and let's just regraph that. So what's happening here with the shading map is it's remapping the brightness of the pixel after shading. So if we look here, this is a very, very bright area here, and it's being looked up on the top part of this ramp here. So the blue area is going to be the highlight, and then as it gets darker, it's moving down the map and it's capturing the bottom part of the ramp. This is really nice if you for getting a toon-like shader. So you just change the interpolation, let's say to none, and you'll get these nice sort of flat bands of color. Okay, so you can get like a flat toon-like shader for your objects in the scene. Then the last type of shader that we have is the surface shader. And the surface shader is really, it's just a pass-through node or a null node. And what it does is it translates unrecognizable shading networks into legitimate ones. So when you start working with utility nodes, sometimes at the end of your network you're going to have a utility node instead of, for instance, a shading group node. And so Maya's not actually going to recognize that as a shading group. You won't be able to assign it to your object. So what you're going to do is you're going to take that whole network and you're going to pass it most likely through the out color. Okay, so this is just a pass-through node so that Maya can recognize something as a legitimate shading network. Another material that we have available in Maya is the ocean shader. And what I've got here is just a simple plane, and I'm going to go to the Create menu, Materials, go to the Ocean Shader. And what the Ocean Shader is really good for is creating water effects. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to assign that shader. And if we look at the attribute editor over here, under Ocean Attributes, we have a number of attributes that we can use to change the look of the water. So, change the wave height, the turbulence, etc. It's going to do a render of just the defaults. Okay, so that's what the shader looks like by default. We'll just save that. And let's change some of these attributes. You can change the wind. Let's change the wave height, make it higher. We can change the turbulence, bring that down a little bit. Because these are ramps, you can actually add ramp handles. Okay. Make the wave peaking a little bit higher. And then the other thing is the common material attributes are just underneath that, underneath the ocean attributes. So things like transparency and diffuse, so on. So we'll just do a render and compare those two. Okay, so this is with the changes I just made, and that's default. Now if I were to set in my render globals this to render from frame 1 to 30, you'll actually see the waves move. So it's a really, really nice effect. And you can actually use this in Mental Ray for Maya to throw caustics on things like boats or bridges or rocks or things like that. The next shader that we'll look at is the ramp shader. Now this shader is used to create cartoon-like effects. And I'll show you a movie. So what we have here are some bouncing spheres with the ramp shader on it with nice sort of flat bands of color, creating a cartoon-like effect. And the nice square highlight is from an area light above, and we're using depth map shadows as well. Okay, so it looks nice, cartoony, flat effect. So I'm just going to open up a file. And what I've got in the file here is just a point light and a sphere. And just under the Create Materials, I'm just going to select Ramp Shader. And you'll notice that under the Common Material Attributes, when we look in the Attribute Editor, that some of the basic attributes have a number of attributes themselves that we can use to create this sort of cartoon-like effect. So I'm just going to assign the shader. Okay, let's go back to the Attribute Editor. Now this area in here is like a ramp, so what we're going to do is we're going to add a ramp handle so that we can transition from one color to another. So for the selected color right now, I'm just going to choose a dark blue. Then just click in the field here just like a regular ramp, and under the selected color for that, we'll change something like a white or a light blue. Okay, and if we do a render, that's the result. Now our color input can actually change how this renders out. Currently we're using light angle, but we could use facing angle or brightness, and you can see how the brightness is actually changed in the swatch as well. So different result depending on what your color input is going to be. The other thing that we can do is we can change the interpolation from linear to none. Okay, and then you can control kind of the size of this highlight if you want just by moving the ramp handle. Okay, so now if you wanted to sort of add that black outline, what we're going to do is come down to the incandescent section, and again we're going to add another ramp handle. Just going to leave that where it is, but under this first ramp handle that's at position 0, I'm just going to come into the selected color, and under the HSV, change these values to -1. And this last one, -1. Okay, just make sure that and we'll just accept that and do a render. Okay, so you can see that we have a black outline now. If we wanted to make that thicker, we could actually just move that ramp handle up. The Mental Ray for Maya shaders that are available, just under the Create menu, we'll talk about those later on in the presentation.
New with version 6, we have a nice piece of functionality in the Hypershade called bins. These are sorting bins or containers for shading nodes, and they've been added to the Hypershade to help you organize and track shading nodes in your scenes. There's a default master bin here. It contains all shading nodes in your scene, and you can add any number of additional bins to a scene and assign nodes to one or more of those bins. So by strategically naming the bins, you can quickly and more easily locate shading assets to work with them. So I've got this scene here. I'm just going to take you through the basic functionality associated with these bins. There's a button up here that allows me to create an empty bin, and I get a window prompting me for a bin name. I'm going to call this Cube and create another one called Sphere. And another bin will be called Cone. And now I can just middle mouse button drag the assets or nodes from the Hypershade's working area into the appropriate bin or holding container over here. So I'm going to middle mouse button drag the cube shader into the cube bin, and the sphere shader into the sphere bin, and the cone shader into the cone bin. And now the beauty of this is that if you had a scene with 200, 300 plus shaders, nodes that you wanted to organize into containers, you can do so, and you can quickly select the contents of that bin using the right mouse button pop-up menu here, select content, and there's my, my asset selected here.